I never trust men who arrive too late in the desert, especially when they bring promises too big to be true. It was late afternoon when his wagon rolled through the gates of Red Hollow. There was no sound of horses, no dust in the air, only creak of heavy wheels dragging a box covered in dark cloth. The man descended slowly, tall, too thin, with sunken eyes, as if he'd seen more graves than births. He introduced himself as Doctor, though none of us had heard his name before. He claimed to bring medicines capable of healing mortal wounds, restoring broken bones, and banishing fever from even the weakest body. The residents, starving for hope, welcomed him as a miracle in a land where death often comes before help. Any promise of life is treated as gold. Women wept with gratitude. Men offered him lodging, and even the saloon, accustomed to dry laughter, fell into respectful silence as he passed. But something was wrong. I saw it in the way his hands trembled as he held the leather suitcases. Doctors' hands don't usually have grave diggers' calluses. The smell coming from them wasn't of alcohol or herbs, but of iron and ancient decay. His eyes never looked at the living, only into the void, as if they saw someone walking alongside that only he could see. In that instant, I understood. It wasn't the cure he brought, but the burden of what death forgot to take away. It was that same night that he performed what he called a miracle. A man had been shot in the leg with a shotgun during a brawl in the saloon. Everyone swore he wouldn't live until dawn. The doctor had him laid on a table and took from his suitcase long needles, thick thread, and a wooden box that creaked like an old coffin. He worked silently, unhurriedly, like someone sewing worn fabric. I watched from the doorway, and I swear I heard no prayers, no cries for help, just the metallic sound of the needle-piercing flesh. When he finished, the man opened his eyes. He stood up slowly, without pain, without a scream, as if nothing had happened. The crowd applauded. They called it a miracle, but I saw differently. His eyes were empty, dull, as if they'd been forgotten inside the wrong body. The smile didn't come, the voice didn't emerge. It was like looking at a doll dressed as a person. The next day, a feverish child was taken to the doctor. She was pale, her chest heaving. He touched her skin, murmured words no one understood, and within minutes, the fever disappeared. The little girl stood up, but walked as if obeying invisible orders. Her mother wept with joy, but I saw only silence on the girl's face. It was clear to me this wasn't life restored. It was just forced movement, flesh stitched together, breath pushed by something that wasn't a soul. And I tell you who hear me, now. It was at that moment that I realized Red Hollow hadn't gained a doctor. It had taken in a gravedigger who refused to give up his dead. But that was just the beginning. Because what I discovered in his wagon would make even the bravest abandon this road. If you dare, stay with me until the end. My suspicions wouldn't leave me alone. While the town thanked the doctor, I decided to follow in his footsteps. I waited for dawn, when even the wind seems to sleep, and went to the barn where he kept his wagon. The boards creaked softly, and the smell that escaped from inside wasn't medicine. It was the same smell I'd smelled at many funerals: iron, rot, and decaying wood. I slowly opened the door and saw his suitcase open on a table. Inside, there were no vials of herbs or gleaming clean scalpels, as any real doctor should carry. There were rusty needles, thick thread, and scraps of cloth soaked in dried blood. Beside them, glass jars held something that made my breath catch: fingers, broken bones, and scraps of skin floating in a dark liquid. But what chilled my blood most was a wooden box in the corner. I opened it and found wax masks molded into human faces. They were the faces of townspeople, some already dead and buried for months. I remembered the empty eyes of the cured and understood. He wasn't saving anyone. He was stitching together bodies, patching up the dead, and restoring movement to something that should have already rested. In that moment, I realized that what walked the streets of Red Hollow was no longer made of flesh and bone. It was made of thread, needle, and silence. And I tell you, what I saw that night was just the beginning. Because when I followed him to the abandoned barn outside of town, I discovered he wasn't working alone, and that the dead of Red Hollow still walked among us. The next night, I followed the doctor to the end of the dusty road, where an abandoned barn stood. No one had dared use since a farmer died years before. The bloody moon dimly illuminated the entrance, and the chains on the door jingled to themselves, as if they knew they held a secret that shouldn't be seen. I leaned against the outer wall, listening. They weren't horses, they weren't men. The sound was of uneven, dry footsteps, like boots dragging helplessly. I peeked through the crack. What I saw still haunts me today. Inside the barn, coffins were lined up, but none of them closed. The bodies I'd once known men from Red Hollow whom I'd helped bury stood upright, stitched together like grotesque dolls. The black lines crisscrossed skin, bones, and joints, as if the doctor had reinvented their bodies with a needle and macabre patience. Each of them breathed soundlessly, merely inflating and deflating like old bellows. The doctor walked in the center, his arms open like a conductor guiding a cursed orchestra. He whispered words in a strange language, and the dead obeyed him. One raised his stitched arm, another turned his head at an impossible angle, and all together they took a step forward, as if they were puppets tied to the same invisible string. My stomach lurched. These men were no longer citizens of Red Hollow, no longer fathers, sons, or friends. They were empty flesh, molded to remain standing. One of them recognized me, or so it seemed, hissed it up. I swiveled toward me, and the silence of that moment weighed more heavily than any gunfight I'd ever faced. My hand instinctively went to the handle of the revolver, but my heart told me that gunpowder would be useless. How do we kill something that no longer belongs to the living? I remained motionless, watching as the doctor smiled, his yellowed teeth gleaming in the lamplight. He said death wasn't an end, just raw material, denned, and in that cursed barn, I understood. Red Hollow wasn't just in danger. It was being stitched together, piece by piece, to become a place where the dead would never rest. And I tell you who hear me now, that was the moment I realized the city wasn't sick, it was being prepared. And when I tried to face that man, I discovered my greatest enemy wasn't him, but what he had already brought back. I couldn't lie in wait any longer. I entered the barn with the star heavy on my chest and the revolver firmly in my hand. The doctor looked at me as if he'd been expecting me. His smile was thin, tired, and in his deep eyes was the certainty that I had nothing to fear. "Sheriff," he drawled, "I didn't come to kill. I came to heal. The only ones who don't understand are those who still cling to what's lost." Behind the stitched bodies stepped forward 6 men. I knew 3 of them dead in duels, 2 of fever, 1 drowned in the river. All had been buried by my own hands, and now they walked again, the thick threads stretching their joints like marionettes. My fingers tightened on the revolver's grip until it hurt. I fired. The bullet tore through one of their chests, but he only swayed, fell to his knees, and rose again, his seam vibrating like a plucked string. The doctor chuckled softly. "They're not just made of flesh anymore, Sheriff. They're made of obedience." I took a step back, but they advanced in unison, eyes empty, mouths sewn shut, plea in eternal silence. Each shot I fired did little more than slow their progress. It was like facing death itself, inevitable, slow, and patient. At that moment I realized I was not fighting against men, but against the fate he had already sealed for the city. And I tell you, if you think that was the end, you're wrong, because what came next showed that it wasn't Red Hollow who was in danger, was me. The bullets were no longer worth anything, and my eyes could no longer distinguish the living from the dead. Everyone was a stitched-together shadow, moved by a force I couldn't control. The doctor remained in the center, arms open like the conductor of a profane spectacle. He didn't sweat, didn't tremble, didn't breathe heavily. It was as if life no longer belonged to him. Suddenly, the bodies stopped. They stood motionless, seams taut like dolls waiting for orders. The doctor approached me with slow steps, his voice echoing as if coming from the barn walls. "You buried them all, Sheriff. You let them go. And now I've brought them back, not to live, but to serve." My hands were shaking, not from the useless revolver, but from the star pinned to my chest. With each word he spoke, I felt the metal grow heavier, as if it were melting against my flesh. He lifted his hand and, with a gentle gesture, pulled at something invisible. I felt as if stitches were running through my skin. I looked at my chest. A dark line was visible beneath my shirt, as if someone had begun to sew me up from the inside. I stumbled back, but there was no way out. The entire barn seemed to close in, and the air smelled of cemetery dust. The bodies walked in unison. They didn't speak, didn't breathe. They simply existed, obedient to the thread that bound them. The doctor lifted his chin and whispered, "Soon you'll be useful to Sheriff, even if you don't want to be." I screamed, more out of rage than courage, and fired at the lamp. The fire spread quickly, the dry wood of the barn catching like straw. The doctor didn't move, just smiled. The bodies, flaming, remained standing, motionless, as if not even the fire could free them. I took advantage of the confusion and ran, my heart beating like a war drum. Behind me, the fire engulfed everything, but the doctor's laughter still echoed, mingled with the crackle of the flames. I thought I was free when I arrived in the city. I walked into my office, trying to catch my breath, but then I realized there was no escape. The wooden floor bore no wheel marks, but thick, scattered lines as if someone had sown the floor itself. The smell of dried blood permeated the air, mixed with a heavy, metallic odor that burned the throat. Soaked pieces of cloth lay in the corners, like scraps from some ill-fated operation, and even my desk bore fine scratches, like fingernails trying to break through the wood. It was as if the doctor had been there, stitching together my space the same way he stitched together his dead. And in that moment, I realized the desert hadn't entered with me. He had brought his craft into my life. Since that night, I haven't slept peacefully. Every time I close my eyes, I feel the thread tightening round my chest, as if it were only a matter of time before I, too, would be stitched together. I no longer know if I'm whole, or if part of me already belongs to the doctor. And I leave you with a warning. If you ever meet a man who's too thin, with eyes too deep, promising impossible cures, don't accept, because the price isn't gold or silver. It's your soul, patched, stitched, and condemned to wander without rest. I am Elias Blackthorn, last sheriff of Red Hollow. I have seen many curses cross this desert, but none so cruel as the promise of a doctor who does not heal, only imprisons. And if you think this story ends here, you're wrong. The desert knows no end. It only hides more secrets. And on the next road we cross together, I'll show you one you might prefer never to have heard. If you dare, click on the next story and move. Unjust, don't say later that I didn't warn you.